Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to düzdanışaq, Straight Talk, an Azerbaijani language channel normally broadcasting from Washington, D.C. into Azerbaijan and increasingly the region of South Caucasus. We're glad to see you today on June 14, 2021, 6 days before the elections in Armenia. And the elections in Armenia are going to be our main topic today in our conversation with Richard Giragosian, an American Armenian political observer who is currently in Yerevan, Armenia. We would like to have this conversation. We would have liked to have this conversation in Russian, in a language that is more accessible to the people in the region, but unfortunately it's not possible. So we're speaking English today again. We appreciate your time and your attention to our growing channel, and we hope you are becoming part of our growing regional audience. It is 1303 here in DC, and it's 2103 in Yerevan, Baku, and Tbilisi. So, the elections in Armenia, what's going on? We would like to hear firsthand from our guest. What I wanted to say, preface our conversation by saying that our guest and I, we have known each other for about 15, 20 years. I try to remember exactly the time we first met. I can't. I went to quite a few talks here in Washington, D.C., where Richard was a presenter, a speaker, a panelist, and I admired his style. I admired his willingness to engage with, especially with Azerbaijani journalists and with Azerbaijani members of the audience. And I've known his style for quite a while. I call Richard a masterful pivoter, which I hope Richard does not take it as an insult, but as a compliment, as it is meant to be. So here today, we hope to hear straight talk, just like the channel is called, and I'm pretty sure we're going to get a lot of that from our guest. Richard, good evening. How are you?
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be back on Straight Talk.
Thank you very much. And we appreciate your time today. We hope to see you again to do post-election analysis if you have time. What's going on? What's in the air in Armenia right now? What is happening? It must be a very exciting time. Is it a good time, good exciting, bad exciting? What's going on?
Well, from a general sense, in a broader context, unfortunately, it's very toxic. The politics are defined largely by negativity. We have a rather vicious and vindictive trading of accusations between the opposition and the government. But the real reason defining this rather negative environment is it is rooted in the pre-existing polarization of Armenian society, which is largely also driven by the unexpected and severe loss of the war for Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. That post-war reality is now the current narrative, and unfortunately driving the discourse into negative territory, largely because the political environment in Armenia is in uncharted waters. This is the first time ever an incumbent Armenian leader has lost Nagorno-Karabakh, and in terms of insecurity and uncertainty, there are many unanswered questions going forward.
You know, I wanted to ask a separate question about the, let's say, the role of the war and maybe the role Azerbaijan is playing in the discourse right now, but it seems impossible to separate the whole issue from the elections in Armenia. Let's, for 1 second, take a step back and pretend the war did not happen and pretend that Azerbaijan is not sort of like a major factor in the elections. Are there any other policy discourse points on which the election is being run? Or is it the war all the time, Azerbaijan all the time?
That's a very good question, İsmayıl. And I would say that in the context of putting the war aside, there was a growing sense of frustration with the government of Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan well before the war. Don't forget, he's come to power in a rare victory of nonviolence and people power, in a rather impressive degree of opening a new chapter in Armenian democracy. Under his leadership in 2018, we've had the first free and fair election in Armenia in December 2018 for many years, giving him a rare commodity of legitimacy, being democratically elected. But faced with dangerously high expectations, the government of Prime Minister Pashinyan had faltered well before the war. There was a sense that reform, even democratization and anti-corruption, was increasingly becoming imperiled, arbitrary. And Pashinyan has long been defined by a sense of reckless, impulsive governance rather than any real thought out process of public policy formulation. So, even leading up to the war, as devastating and tragic as it was, there were serious policy issues to be debated. However, the second factor here is this is very much a snap election, an early election, and it is designed to address the polarization or political stalemate in the country. Having said that, I would add that as important as this election is, it's simply not enough to address the underlying deficiencies in governance.
Richard, this situation in Armenia is currently being used by detractors of democracy. Not only in Azerbaijan, I'll be open, but also I believe these sorts of views are emanating from Russia as well. You know, this sort of like a background of ridiculing democratic processes, saying that democracies are inherently weak and vulnerable, especially in the face of a war, that democratically elected governments are somehow less efficient in addressing a plethora of issues, including, wartime situations, but also maybe COVID. Um, is that a fair criticism of the democratic process? Is having democratically elected government somehow a detriment to the nation's stability and security? Are these views, do you hear a lot of that in Armenia right now?
Unfortunately, yes. And having lived in Armenia, moving here from the United States over a dozen years ago, conspiracy theories and perceptions are equally as important as reality in this part of the world, unfortunately. What we see, however, let's be honest, the war was won by authoritarian Azerbaijan with the assistance of equally authoritarian Turkey. And at the end of the day, authoritarian Russia swept in and stabilized the situation, which also raises real questions about the value of both European values and ideals, but also the adequacy, the resiliency of democracy. But I would also argue that the Pashinyan government in Armenia is equally to blame for the loss of confidence in democracy and has done far too little to actually invest in the institutions of democracy. And in this context, there's an interesting lesson from neighboring Georgia, where in the Georgian context, it was very important in the case of Mikhail Saakashvili, the former leader. It was very important to have an individual Democrat. But the lesson from Georgia is individual Democrats are good, but nowhere near enough. It's the democratic institutions that matter. And having said that, going forward, democracy in Armenia is being imperiled, threatened, under assault. And I am worried about the future.
You know, one of the guests on our show, I believe it was one of the guests from Armenia, basically presented the choice that the Armenian public, the Armenian people will be making as a choice between today and yesterday. Is that so? What are the current trends? What is going on? What do you think will happen? At least, what do the numbers and statistics are suggesting that is going to happen? Also, do you have a feel that the election will be fair and it'll be an honest process, or do we expect shenanigans?
Well, let me take the second part of the question first because it allows me to highlight the positive. There are deep and justifiably prudent expectations for free and fair elections. And this is very important in offering a chance to have back-to-back free and fair elections, giving whoever's elected this rare degree of legitimacy. Having said that, we do see a campaign that is marked by a poverty of ideas. It's in many ways a political contest of personalities rather than a competition of policy alternatives. And in many ways, it's an ugly beauty contest in terms of these political choices. And in this context, from an American perspective, this is a worst example of a choice of lesser evils, which we often experiment and experience in American presidential politics. And in Armenia, the observation of the past versus the future is very accurate. I would go even further. The contest between the opposition, including three former presidents, is very much a demonstration of the Jurassic Park effect of Armenian politics, a last ditch effort at comeback by a former corrupt authoritarian government. And former presidents Robert Kocharian, Serge Sargsyan, Levon Terpetrosyan are all running on campaigns based on a nostalgia for the past and a return to authoritarianism. But the interesting addition analytically is it's more subtle because one of the most interesting aspects of the nonviolent revolution of 2018 was that it was a demographic revolution as well. Pashinyan, as prime minister, is under the age of 40. The former presidents and much of the opposition are over the age of 60. In many ways, this is a demographic division. And this is why, at the end of the day, for many Armenians and for the youth as an agent of change, I do think there's little attraction to the opposition. And as much as there's frustration with the Pashinyan government, many of the undecided voters and that crucial bloc will actually, at the end of the day, bite their tongue and probably vote for the incumbent government. That's not necessarily good for democracy, but compared to the threat of the opposition, it's probably a wise decision.
Richard, in terms of, let's say, foreign players in the Armenian election, it is my question. It is sort of quite interesting to see it with your eyes from, from the ground. Is the opposition, let's say, people of the likes of Kocharian and Sargsyan, are they seen as pro-Russian candidates? Is there such a spin, such a view of those? Is this inherently a choice between a nascent democratically elected Pashinyan and, let's say, Russian influence in the embodied by these two gentlemen that I mentioned?
Ironically, when we look at this issue of Russia, what we see is across the board, across the entire political landscape, there is nothing but different degrees of submission and subordination to Russia. It's not a question of pro-Russian, it's a question of how pro-Russian. And the reason for this is largely because the net outcome of the war for Nagorno-Karabakh was very much a Russian victory. Armenia is very much now much more firmly locked within a Russian orbit. And there's simply little we can do for that overdependence on Russia. Having said that, what's most interesting is the opposition, and especially the former president, Robert Kocharian, and others, who in the past were the chosen and favorite partners for the Kremlin. What's interesting is their requests, their expectations for Russian support and backing were rebuffed. And it is very interesting from a perspective of analyzing Russia that Moscow has chosen not to support a risky move to back the pro-Russian unpopular opposition, which would present a risk, but rather to have Pashinyan. And the reason is the opposite scenario from Belarus, Lukashenko. For Putin in Russia, Pashinyan is a trophy, very much a legitimate, democratically elected leader of Armenia who is now prisoner or a trophy for Putin. This is an important message of deterrence to other aspiring leaders in the near abroad, the former Soviet space. And it's a very attractive, valuable addition to Putin's arsenal. In that way, I think at the most, we should see a Russian willingness to work with, let's say, the opposition as a marginal presence in the newly elected, to be elected parliament, but to keep the incumbent government as a demonstration of Russian control, power, and influence. And in this way, I do think that Armenian sovereignty and independence is actually undermined going forward.
You know, this question I ask quite often, and I ask Dr. Liberidian, as you probably have seen, whether there are concerns in Armenia by at least a segment of the population about the future liberty, sovereignty, and independence of Armenia. The way I see it, and I express this view quite often, is three South Caucasus republics, they sort of in the same boat. If one loses legitimacy, if one loses sovereignty, it's not good news for either two of them. In that regard, is there an understanding in the Armenian society, at least some segment of it, that there is something much larger at stake here when it comes to Russia, its ambitions and aspirations in the region? Is there a concern that Armenia is ceding some of its independence, or maybe taking its future to the pawnbroker, or that does not figure into these elections at all?
Well, the easy answer is yes. It's a viable and also vehement concern. What we see at the same time is it's almost a degree of resignation in Armenia that the future safety and security of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are now dependent on Russian peacekeepers. And while our sovereignty and independence is now undermined by this overdependence on Russia, what's also interesting is in the past, for many years, there was only one area of agreement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and even Nagorno-Karabakh. They were all against Russian peacekeepers coming into the region. And it was smart. The war, however, required Russia to impose a unilateral ceasefire. That was our only way to halt the fighting, whether we like it or not. But in general, Armenians across the board, no matter their political affiliation, understand that Russia is a greater challenge than Azerbaijan or Turkey, because Russia is now an unreliable friend. That's a very more serious challenge than dealing with Baku or Ankara. And in this context, whether it's the vague promises of defense and security, Russia for many years has been the number one arms provider to both sides of this conflict. And it's really not in Russia's interest to see a peace deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. My hope, however, over the medium to long term, is that Russia becomes overextended and its military buildup in Armenia, its peacekeeping deployment in Nagorno-Karabakh, become seen as more of a threat, a shared threat, where Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, as you point out, have a shared interest in regional collective security. And the interloper and threat here over the long term is and will be Russian meddling and interference.
You know, it's quite concerning to me in general. Of course, I cannot put myself into the shoes of the Armenian people, but it's quite concerning to me that there is unwillingness to sort of engage with with Azerbaijan or Turkey on some semblance of reconciliation now that we have seen that it is, as you say, in Russia's interest to keep this region always, on its toes. No peace deal. Is it possible within our lifetimes, Richard, that we will see the shift in the views? And I know I'm asking this question in a quite difficult context of, some, let's say, aggressive moves by Azerbaijan currently. But is there a possibility to see not Russia as a guarantor of stability and security for Armenia, but sort of reach a regional consensus that no country in South Caucasus or the region will ever attack Armenia? And how founded are the fears of the Armenian people that Azerbaijan wants to attack Armenia proper or Turkey wants to attack Armenia proper? Is there a way you see by which this thinking will shift or change sometime soon?
I am more optimistic, and there is a degree of promise as much as there is a demonstrable degree of peril. And what I'm talking about first is right now, in the short term, the urgency and the immediate challenge is the full and complete return of all prisoners of war from Azerbaijani captivity. Armenia no longer holds any prisoners, they were all returned. But Azerbaijan is openly defying Moscow and the terms of the ceasefire agreement. And it's become a transactional bargaining by Azerbaijan in order to garner greater concessions and diplomatic dividends. Having said that, this is why in Armenia the war is not over. We are still in a prolonged state of war, unable to mourn, unable to move on, as long as the prisoners are still either being convicted, put on trial, or in detention in Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. The reason I'm a little more worried is this is escalated to border incursions in terms of an effort or a failed effort to try to divide and demarcate the border involving Azerbaijani incursions into Armenian territory. The bigger challenge is Armenia no longer has territorial integrity. We used to be the only country in this region with territorial integrity. That's gone. And in fact, we've reversed positions. The humiliation, the frustration of Azerbaijan since the 90s is now on the Armenian side, where the myth of invincibility is gone for the Armenians.
Did it evoke some reflection? Sorry, Richard. Did that help Armenian people understand how Azerbaijan felt for 30 years?
It will. It has not yet. In other words, we're still in emotional shock. And moreover, we're in a state of denial where until we recognize the problem, it's difficult to address or treat the problem. But in this context, the prisoner issue, border demarcation, once we're able to turn the page, there are two areas of progress of diplomatic engagement between Armenia and Azerbaijan today. The first is a trilateral working group, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, regarding the restoration of trade and transport. It's a good example of diplomatic engagement, the need to return to diplomatic negotiations. The second is a back channel series of meetings between the heads of the national security services of Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's very important to have a line of communication to prevent miscalculation.
Is it open now, do you think? Do you know if it's open?
It is. It's ongoing.
Okay.
It's ongoing. Just as we've seen this recent Georgian American assisted prisoner release by Azerbaijan in exchange for minefield maps, we do see this demonstrates the need to return to diplomacy. The obstacle, unfortunately, right now remains Azerbaijan. which sees itself as the complete victor in the war and is not yet ready to return to diplomacy. But what I'm thinking about in positive terms is not reconciliation. That's going to take a generation. This is more similar to the previous effort, like Armenia, Turkey, of normalization. And, for example, even with the Pashinyan government, it kept the same policy as the previous Armenian government regarding Turkey, a policy of no preconditions. The Biden recognition of the Armenian genocide was a US, not an Armenian decision. In this context, normalization is much more practical. But at the same time, looking more strategically, we do see an accidental convergence of interests between Moscow and the West in terms of Russia working with the West and not against the West in a shared interest, by accident, of post-war stability. Even though it legitimizes Russia's unilateral peacekeeping deployment, it is an interest in post-war stability to prevent renewed fighting.
Richard, there are a lot of things to unpack, but let me first address the issue of prisoners of war, as you call them. These people were apprehended in Azerbaijan, in internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan. If I'm not mistaken, even Armenia recognizes it as Azerbaijan after the peace, unilateral peace agreement, whatever we call it, the document was signed. At this point, at what point do military prisoners of war become saboteurs who entered the country illegally, illegitimately, killed civilians, and attacked the military? I mean, at what point can we draw a line and say, okay, up until now, these were prisoners of war, people who were apprehended, captured, and after this point, this is already a willful incursion into another state? Let me put another context. I asked you a question in a closed forum about the demonstrations in Armenia by the parents of the newly conscripted military who are being sent by Armenia into Karabakh, which is a territory of Azerbaijan, as we all recognize it. Armenia itself does not recognize the independence. So what do you call, and for what reason, if Armenia is in shock, if Armenia were defeated, for what reason does the Armenian government, the military, the Ministry of Defense, sends its conscripts into a foreign nation's territory, and then we're all hearing about these prisoners of war? To what extent is this fair?
Well, to be honest, there are some discrepancies.
Okay.
In other words,
Okay.
Approximately 6 or 8 weeks ago, there was an official Armenian government decision to no longer provide conscripts or military support to Nagorno-Karabakh.
6 to 8 weeks ago, sorry, it's June right now, so it's about a month ago, a month and a half ago, but the war ended in November. I mean, how does that work?
I'm not defending either the decision or the timing. I'm just clarifying.
But was there an explanation about this or no?
Only a rather inarticulate explanation that in the post-war reality, it no longer makes any sense to deploy Armenian personnel beyond the borders of Armenia. This is also a reflection of the weakness of the Armenian government on national security issues. The second, more important clarification is where I disagree with you. We have over 200 Armenian prisoners of war and civilian hostages. What I'm arguing, though, is the overwhelming majority of that number were seized and detained before the November 8th ceasefire agreement. The others were captured after the ceasefire agreement. There is a burden of proof, and there could be evidence into what they were doing while captured and where they were. I agree. But the overwhelming majority are afforded Geneva Convention rights. And this is not my information based on Armenian sources. but my work with the International Committee for the Red Cross, who were setting up video messaging for the families, etc. So this human element is what's prolonging the state of war. And I'm making no defense of Armenian policy or of Azerbaijani policy other than the humanitarian aspect, where what is best is a decision similar to the 15 prisoners of war that were returned that were also detained before the ceasefire agreement. It's a different category, in my opinion.
You know, since we're talking about the humanitarian aspect, and I hear you when you say that it does not allow Armenia to consider the war over. You know, people cannot get through the grieving or mourning process. But Azerbaijani civilians, including journalists, keep blowing up on the landmines. You know, whether these landmines are being have been put there before the war or after the war, as some people claim, freshly installed landmines by the sabotage groups that that come into the territory of Azerbaijan and put those mines on the roads. This remains a question. I wouldn't know. I'm not in the region. I don't know. But what I'm saying,
But I agree, it remains a serious question.
it is a serious question. That question brings into play the whole prisoner of war situation as well. Richard, I mean, I understand that Azerbaijanis also want to move on and they also want to grieve and bury their dead, but unfortunately we keep doing that. Only last week, two of my colleagues from the state television and state news agency blew up on a landmine while, doing nothing related to the war, covering the aftermath. Is there an understanding in Armenia that, civilians in the neighboring country who keep dying every day on landmines is also a major concern for the other side?
Of course. In other words, it is not a minority opinion in Armenia that the outcome of the war demonstrated or reaffirmed how this is an unacceptable tragedy. And in many ways, many people blame politicians who actually have no accountability for sending young men to die. What I would also urge is the necessity to condemn that particular incident involving the deaths of the Azerbaijani journalists, because if we look at the situation objectively, they were driving on a road and the mine must have been planted fairly recently because it wouldn't be in the road. And I do think this is part of the problem that must be resolved by a return to diplomacy and negotiations. Minefield maps are another problem. For example, after months of denial by the Armenian government that the maps didn't exist, they suddenly appeared as leverage or bargaining chips for the return of some prisoners. That's rather disingenuous. It undermines credibility. And I do think the lack of confidence, the lack of credibility is also a serious problem and shortcoming. Hence, all the more we need a return to diplomatic engagement.
You know, I read in BBC Azerbaijani just today that Nikol Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, at a campaign rally somewhere, brought up the issue of supplying a very small portion of the landmines map to Azerbaijan. My question is, after months of denial that these landmine maps even exist, does it put sort of his credibility in sort of a peril? And what is the reaction of the people in Armenia is it seen as a concession, as an unwarranted concession to Azerbaijan, or is it seen in the, let's say, greater aspect of trying to engage and trying to resolve the situation? Because I understand this is a very brave statement for the ruling prime minister, because he opens himself up for the attacks from the opposition, who already think that Armenia made a lot of concessions. Is that not?
Well, I can say as an analyst, my understanding is this was a political speech and a political act of posturing. In other words, this was more done out of weakness and insecurity rather than confidence, in terms of the prime minister most likely anticipating attacks from the opposition, that he's too soft, too weak. And I do think it has a dangerous impact on undermining trust and confidence in the prime minister himself, especially among the analytical community here and in Azerbaijan. Secondly, it also shows the degree of pressure in this toxic political environment by these hardline nationalists and destructive opposition from the old government, who actually, if we look at the case of former President Robert Kocharyan, is very much a threat and a dangerous political figure. But it also shows how primitive and crude the political discourse is. And unfortunately, the Armenian population deserves much better.
Richard, let me read a comment from our guest, Inner City. He says, if there, he or she, I don't know, if there is no agreed border, meaning between Azerbaijan and Armenia, how can there be incursions? So this person is probably taking an exception to you calling what's going on border incursions. This puts it in a wider context, I believe, and feel free to comment on any aspect of this question. Should there be first a comprehensive peace agreement between the two countries that would sort of stave off any possible resurgence of the conflict? So now we don't have clear borders. There is an attempt of demarcation, and we're bringing up the issue of incursions. Is there a way you can clarify this?
Yes. In other words, for me, it's an incursion because the Azerbaijani military personnel, in some cases, as far as 12 to 20 kilometers inside what traditionally has been Armenian territory throughout 70 years of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not taking a position who's right and who's wrong in that regard. What I do think the way forward and the way out, even before a peace agreement, is a border demarcation commission with legal institutional standing and to solve the immediate problem. The immediate problem is both the Armenian and the Azerbaijani sides have different Soviet period maps of reference. There's no common agreed upon starting point. But there is a commitment from Baku and Yerevan that let's return to the Soviet border of Armenia and Azerbaijan. But even the Russians have failed on purpose to propose a starting point, one particular map.
Yeah, because the maps have been fluid for those who are watching from outside the region.
And I've seen the maps. It's different scale as well, which also doesn't resolve everything. So what I'm saying is, I'm not contesting Armenia's point or Azerbaijan's, but if we can form a formal legal commission on demarcation, just like Azerbaijan still has today with Georgia, and this is the way forward, and it will most undoubtedly be based on an acceptance of the Soviet era borders. Now, the good news, there are new concessions coming from the Armenian government to the Azerbaijani side in the coming weeks after the election regarding so-called enclaves and exclaves along the north of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. And there will be a fresh opportunity after the election to actually expand that discussion or negotiation to the broader areas of contest. But don't forget, the real provocation here is also because Russia is using this to justify an expanded border security role for the Russians, taking control of a third external Armenian border. Russia already has control of the Armenian-Turkish and Armenian-Iranian border. This is the perfect pretext for Russia to now acquire a third external border of Armenia. And I see the timing of these incidents from the Azerbaijani side not about the Armenian election, but driven more by Azerbaijan's attempt to maintain the initiative on the ground because of the change in leadership and command of the Russian peacekeepers, which is happening now. This gives Azerbaijan a stronger hand on the ground. Interestingly, this is why Turkey is not very active in supporting Azerbaijan in the border issue, because this is much less about Nagorno-Karabakh and much more about bilateral pressure.
So, new concessions that you mentioned coming from Armenia in the coming weeks, will they happen regardless of who comes to power in Armenia? What I'm asking you to
No.
do is maybe put it in a broader context of what will change, what will happen if Pashinyan remains in power, and what will happen if his government is toppled as a result of the election. Can we look into the alternate realities?
Well, it's even more than an alternate reality. It's also perhaps an evidence-based scenario. First is, if the Pashinyan government fails to secure a majority and the opposition comes, part of the hesitation by Russia to back in a risky move the opposition is that it's the Pashinyan leadership that is committed to the Russian-imposed ceasefire agreement. The opposition may challenge that, may actually fail to adhere to the terms. Second, most likely, any concessions going forward would be very difficult for any other leader, any other government, simply because their whole campaign is based on accusing Pashinyan of treason and capitulation or surrender. So what this would do is increase the danger of revenge, retribution in the future, increase the risk of a hardline posture, and unfortunately would set back any kind of gains in diplomatic engagement to date, and thereby undermining the outlook for diplomatic negotiations. This is why I think for Turkey and for Azerbaijan, surprisingly, they're more satisfied with seeing Pashinyan remain in power, but as a weak interlocutor.
But isn't that a very, let's say, fine line to walk? I mean, let's say somebody in Baku or in Ankara is trying to undermine Pashinyan. Does it not come into question as to what degree do we do that, not to topple his government, but to keep it intact but weak? I mean, isn't that a very intricate game that neither Baku nor Ankara would be able to play correctly if they wanted to?
Well, yes, hence the danger. In other words, especially with the flare up, the escalation of border tension, whether the calculation in Baku was right or wrong, the impact was to weaken and undermine Pashinyan, to make this a much closer election. Hence, it could be a dangerous backlash against what's good for the region. But at the same time, I do think in Baku, for years, the lack of engagement, the lack of communication has led to misperception. And both Armenian and Azerbaijani government officials, by not talking to each other, fail to understand each other. And this is why we need much more engagement diplomatically, but also people-to-people contact.
Richard, what I'm trying to do right now, if technology cooperates, is to show some clips from Armenian television. These are, from what I understand, I don't speak the language, but from what I understand, these are campaign ads for the upcoming elections from one of the opposition parties. What they do is they show a hesitant voter reading the bulletins in the booth and imagining that if he or she votes for a particular party, I believe the party of Nikol Pashinyan, they are endorsing, they're envisioning a full-fledged Azerbaijani occupation. Here's a police officer, an Azerbaijani, stopping an Armenian motorist and asking for a bribe of 10 manat, which is Azerbaijan's national currency. In another one, we see a fisherman being stopped by the Coast Guard, Azerbaijani Coast Guard, who looks very Armenian, I should say. And here's a young lady reading a history book about Shusha, and which says that Shusha belongs to Azerbaijan. So basically, what I'm trying to ask you is this. As I understand, the elections in Armenia, the current snap elections, are pretty much all about Azerbaijan and the war with Azerbaijan and the issue of the future relations with Azerbaijan. Who are these political technologists? What country do they come from? It's a very clever way to instill fear into the Armenian public, to show that, you know, if you vote for a particular candidate, what you're voting for is a full-fledged Armenian occupation of Armenia by Azerbaijan. Does this message resonate? Are people buying this? Let me ask you the American way.
Well, unfortunately, it resonates too much, too well, because it's playing to fear. It's politics of hatred and fear. It's Donald Trump style, lowest common denominator. If we look at the American political situation with immigration and building the wall. But at the same time, this is local. It is authentic. This is called black PR in Armenian and Russian. And it is maybe impressive, crafty, innovative. But what it does for many voters is reveals what's missing. In other words, this message, emotional fear based, is a temporary message. In other words, it's not sustainable because there's no follow up. There's no explanation of what the other party would do differently. And this is where the opposition fails, to either rebrand themselves or to offer a competing alternative proposal. And none of them have said what they would have done differently in the war and what they will do differently with Azerbaijan. So for many ordinary voters, their same reaction the day after seeing that is, okay, fine, this is a real threat. But why am I going to be safer in voting for the other party? This is also the missing ingredient. And exposing the weakness and limited appeal of even that opposition fear-based campaign.
If I may, I was watching these ads. I gotta say they're very crafty. While you were talking, I was showing them repeatedly. Do you see them on the Armenian television? Do they play a lot?
Yes.
Who are these?
Yes, but it's interesting,
Yeah, right.
İsmayıl, because it's much worse than America with Fox News. In Armenia, the TV especially is fragmented into opposition channels or government channels. So the reach, the audience for these ads is actually rather low because the opposition small TV stations have limited reach in terms of low audience and even in terms of signal reach, a limited market. So a lot of this has been also supplemented on social media. Facebook and Twitter are also now arsenals of hatred and in terms of black PR, if you will. And for most voters, there is frustration that there's no pocketbook issues. What's going to happen to my pension or my job, COVID-19 economic recovery, etc. And the only person talking policies, interestingly, is former President Levon Petrosyan, who Liberidian worked for. But even that is too little too late. And in many ways, it's not enough. And this is why most people are frustrated with everyone. And they are looking for someone or something fresh and new, which means that I'm worried that in the coming few years, there may be an attraction for someone coming in from the United States or from Moscow, which wouldn't be good for the country in terms of a messiah complex, just as the rise of Trump and Tea Party Republicans was both unexpected and anti-establishment. We may have that danger as well.
I want to give our guest Richard Giragosian a chance to take a sip of water and clear his throat, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to call upon you to like our show, like our current broadcast, so more people would watch it. I understand English is not the most optimal solution and the most accessible language in the region, but I don't speak Armenian, and Richard does not speak Azerbaijani, so we have to find a common language. Richard, you mentioned Twitter. You mentioned what's going on Twitter, and it made me think of your tweet to which I replied, which incidentally led to this interview. If I may read a portion of it, as one of the more significant outcomes from the 44-day war for Nagorno-Karabakh was the demise of the dangerous Armenian quote-unquote myth of invincibility. It is now destructive to perpetuate wishful thinking. Thus, regarding the question of developing military UAVs, we're talking about drones, Armenia should focus on investing in more innovative defensive technology to counter the threat and not seek to match the production of offensive UAVs by trying to quote-unquote catch up with producing inferior models. Richard, what I got from this, and it's probably very evident from my reply, is a country like Armenia, and I'm not trying to sort of like rub it in that Armenia's economic situation is difficult after the war, but in this particular context, is this really what bothers people the most? Whether Armenia, should build defensive or offensive military technology and catch up in terms of defending ourselves or offensive weaponry? Are there not voices inside the country who are saying what I said in my reply? It would be great to see, the governments invest in socioeconomic infrastructure, healthcare, etc., especially amid the pandemic. Is this really the level of discourse right now?
Well, unfortunately, yes. And let me also clarify. My specific point was actually to counter a ongoing debate in terms of a military buildup, and it was limited to this drone question. My broader point was Armenia needs to become defensive and not seek to pose an offensive threat. But in general, it's because of the prisoner issue and border insecurity that there is a degree of threat perception that's driving this guns versus butter, not debate, but decision in terms of a dangerous trend and tendency that we have to rearm and rebuild to seek revenge militarily. It's almost like a cycle of retribution that will damage us all, rather than focusing on the true lesson from the war, which was how destructive this is for everyone. And the human cost of the war is beyond the acceptable. But I am confident that over time, we will reach that point. For example, prisoners returned, border demarcation talks begin. That will actually turn the page, and we would be able to return to normalcy. But we're not there yet, to be honest.
You spoke of lowest common denominator and toxicity in the rhetoric of the current election. Do people get eventually tired of that, or does it sort of cater to what they need to hear? Is this part of the cleansing? Is this part of like coming to terms with what happened? This toxicity, vitriol, anger that is aired, in broadcasts or maybe, in the trading accusations. Is this part of the healing process, would you say, or is this taking the whole thing in the wrong direction?
Well, it's a symptom of the illness. It has nothing to do with the healing process. It's not letting off steam. It's playing to the base. And in many ways, this is very limited, very narrow, primitive language tailored to the specific base of the politician. And to be honest, Pashinyan has fallen in the trap of matching the discourse. His latest campaign rallies, he's taken a hammer in his hand
Hmm.
in this ridiculous toxic alpha male contest. At the same time, the opposition leaders have refused to accept an offer to debate each other and instead are challenging each other to a duel. It's the Game
Right.
of Thrones without the theater and the drama. Moreover, this is the opposite of the healing process. And in this way, the Armenian politicians are like alcoholics who refuse treatment because they're in a state of denial and they refuse to admit they have a problem. And until we can get beyond this, we won't be able to enter recovery.
State of denial, and I apologize to those who might be offended by this, but many of the commenters on the Azerbaijani side, I often hear this comparison to the state of denial that the Armenian public in general is living in terms of, we had this war. The outcomes were pretty clear to some of us. To some of us, they're not. I mean, for instance, I did not expect the Spanish Inquisition or the Russian peacekeepers. The thing is, when it comes to denial, do you think that there is some degree, some measure of that going on in the public, among the public in general, not only related to, let's say, a political situation, but overall geopolitical situation that Armenia finds itself in? And if that is true, or whether it's my misperception, but if that is true, what are the ways out of this? I mean, what do you see as, like a bird's eye view situation in Armenia? You're an American, if I'm not mistaken. I don't like defining people for themselves, but you've moved. You're a transplant. You've moved from the United States to Armenia, so you have a fresher look, maybe, or you have a different angle. What do you see the society as? I mean, what is there a denial, certain sort of denial going on there?
Well, yes. And one additional observation or example is even beyond the war, even before the war, the coronavirus. COVID 19 exposed what I call, and excuse my language, Armenia's bullshit exceptionalism. That, oh, we're different, we're Armenian, we're special. We don't need to take precautions of social distancing and mask wearing against the coronavirus. Just as the vaccination rates in Armenia are dangerously and appallingly low, this myth of invincibility is matched by this bullshit exceptionalism. And the reason I would also go further is I moved here, and I may be crazy in some people's eyes, but I'm not an idiot. I'm not a fool. I wouldn't stay in Armenia if I wasn't justifiably optimistic, and I am, simply because of the demographic change. Since 2018, the real agent of change in Armenia is a new generation, one that came of age in independent Armenia and are not Soviet products. And the bulk, the overwhelming majority of these young people studied in Western, European, and American institutions and have more tolerance in general and are much more moderate, whether it's regarding Azerbaijan or social issues within Armenia. And the future is theirs. This is why, despite the frustration with Pashinyan, he does represent a new generation. And Pashinyan, in my opinion, is now a transitional figure. And passing the baton to this new generation is actually grounds for justifiable optimism.
Just so people don't feel so exceptionalist, after all, I will have to say that during the onset of coronavirus, I also read quite interesting commentary coming from surprisingly educated people in Azerbaijan who said that, Turks are not susceptible to COVID, so we have nothing to worry about. So that sort of thing we have in common, unfortunately. Um, let's talk about for 1 second. Let's talk about the recent tapes. If I'm not mistaken, one of the candidates, and I don't want to mess up their name, you will probably be more knowledgeable. Uh, threatened to produce voice recordings of Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and some sites reported that there are transcripts. Has anyone heard the tape itself? And what does it say exactly? Are you aware of the situation? Because I couldn't find the tape itself. I couldn't hear it. I only read the transcript. Is that transcript apocryphal, or is it true?
Well, what's interesting is we have a return to the Soviet practice of kompromat. The KGB using surveillance, confidential information to blackmail officials or politicians. In Armenia, we've had 4 or 5 of these cases. What's interesting, the one particular incident you're talking about, the former government released this recording. And it was also because one of the leading opposition aspirants is a former National Security Service official, ironically appointed by Pashinyan. And ironically, no one has ever heard of this guy until Pashinyan made the mistake to empower him. He's now in the opposition. So we know the source in terms of the security state, the deep state. But what was interesting is the recording was heralded as evidence that Pashinyan was quite willing to sell out Nagorno-Karabakh and compromise and cut a deal with President Aliyev. The actual transcript and the voice recording, to me and to many, demonstrated the exact opposite and actually displayed him in a unusually hardline stance and position regarding the issue. And I think it backfired. But I do think it raises the bigger question of how dangerous this use of kompromat, or compromising material, if you will, is not only a new low in politics, but demonstrates the challenge of the surveillance state mentality.
You know, what I read, and I don't speak Armenian. I cannot attest to the truthfulness of what I've read. But from what I read, 3 state leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan tried to browbeat Armenian prime minister into accepting a certain kind of deal. Yes, if we look at the immediate situation, that is quite interesting. But when you look at the long-term implications, I'm thinking tomorrow there's nothing funny about it, or nothing interesting, or nothing to be joyful about it, because it shows how the politics, realpolitik, actually works. You have Putin, Nazarbayev, and Lukashenko approaching Pashinyan and sort of like pressuring him into accepting something. Tomorrow, this can be Azerbaijani president, Ilham Aliyev, or anyone else. So there is not much fun in reading this. Is this really reflected in the compromat, from what you can tell, because you do speak Armenian? And is there also a point where President Ilham Aliyev allegedly accepted that Karabakh will never be part of Azerbaijan's territory, and Azerbaijan's sovereignty will never be over Karabakh?
Well, 2 responses. First, that particular incident is the one I was referring to, where in the end it made Pashinyan look strong to resist that pressure. And so if it was kompromat, it backfired because it embarrassed the opposition in terms of their empty accusations on that issue. But if we look at the Azerbaijani stance, I would argue as a snapshot in time, pre-war, based on the, let's say, insecurity and lack of confidence of President Ilham Aliyev, because it was the war that made Aliyev finally emerge from the shadow of his father. And it was significant. But prior to the war, yeah, Azerbaijan was looking for a face-saving way to let go of Nagorno-Karabakh. It was not independence, and it was in this referendum process, which was supposed to linger for decades. In other words, the vague promise of an eventual final status referendum as a face-saving way out for everyone. And that's why I think it's fairly reasonable in that context to say yes, even Azerbaijan's leadership realizes Nagorno-Karabakh is not worth it in terms of the bigger picture. The territories outside of the borders of Karabakh were always bigger, larger, and more strategic. But for Azerbaijan, let me just add, one criticism I have of the Armenian side is we failed to understand the humiliation and frustration of the Azerbaijani side in terms of the peace process delivering nothing but frustration and stalemate. And I think we needed to accommodate and afford Azerbaijan a face-saving way rather than this kind of maximalist position by the Armenians diplomatically.
But Richard, when we talk about what a face-saving way, when we talk about some vague referendum idea hanging over the region in the future, indeterminable number of years, isn't that what we have right now? Isn't that what you hear in the pronouncements by the Russian political establishment, be it Lavrov, be it other officials? It doesn't really matter. When they talk about the future, of Nagorno-Karabakh region, when they talk about, at a later date, so and so things will be determined, isn't that pretty much what we have on the ground right now?
It is, but what's different is you no longer have Azerbaijani toleration or acceptance of that. Moreover, let's be realistic. Let's look at the future. Let's look at real scenarios. I see two scenarios for Nagorno-Karabakh based on the premise of Armenia having no diplomatic strategy, no new strategy post-war based on the reality. And in fact, if you look at the Armenian foreign ministry, the minister resigned, 4 deputies resigned, the spokeswoman resigned, the building is vacant. And based on that premise, the worst case scenario for Armenia is Nagorno-Karabakh becomes Nakhichevan, territory that was once Armenian, but no longer. The second scenario, just as bad in some ways, is Nagorno-Karabakh becomes Abkhazia, becomes a Russian garrison state with Russian passports and Russian troops. That's the worst of both worlds. And I don't see any real political will from Azerbaijan or any diplomatic strategy by Armenia to engage in sincere diplomatic negotiations based on concession and compromise.
Just for the record, and I don't want to engage on this issue, I disagree with your characterization of Nakhichevan, but we will not enter the protracted arguments because this will get us nowhere. Richard, I wanted to ask you, actually redirect the question from Zaur Jafarov, if I may. He asks, do you think there are secret clauses or clause to the statement signed on the 9th of November? In a greater context, in a larger context, do you think there is something we don't know, which I already probably can guess the answer, about this unilaterally imposed, as you called it, decision or ceasefire by Russia? Is there other things we don't know? And is this document does it answer all the questions? Because on the face of it, when I looked at it when it was signed, the instant analysis and, post-game analysis was that nothing is clear. It raises more questions than it answers. Are there things that are being fluid right now? In other words, Russia may not be called a reliable partner by any stretch of imagination, neither for you nor for us. And I'm sorry, I'm generalizing. I mean Armenia and Azerbaijan. But other games that Russians are playing around this document right now, do you think?
Well, let me preface my answer first. I've worked for 10 years in the United States Senate. So based on my own US government experience, I would say, of course, Zaward is correct. There are a number of backroom agreements, secret deals, etc. My only clarification is these secret agreements are not in the ceasefire agreement. In other words, what we see is what we get and that's on purpose. Russia has constructed this agreement for the cessation of hostilities in a vague, blanket way on purpose to give them maximum flexibility. It's smart. Moreover, it is not a peace agreement, and it's not a ceasefire agreement as we accept militarily. It's an agreement or a commitment for the cessation of hostilities and the beginning of restoration of trade and transport. What's interesting to me is the vague, unanswered questions are intended to maximize the Russian diplomatic initiative and control and leverage over all parties to the conflict. And this is why I argue for the return to diplomacy. What I don't see, however, is a Sykes-Picot agreement. This isn't a colonial British, French, or American Western deal to carve up the South Caucasus. We're giving them too much credit if we believe that.
Richard, you talked about your experience in the Senate. That actually makes me understand a little more about how you answer questions. It's a very American politician style. I almost want to ask you if you're planning to run for office in the United States. But let's let's concentrate on our region, if we may. West. The West is something we haven't talked. It's another variable. From what I understand, maybe I'm mistaken. Before the war in Armenia, there was a belief, overwhelming belief, that if something like that happens, Russia will fulfill its ally duties. On the other hand, there was a reliance or expectation from the West that it'll step in and not allow the situation to become very unfavorable to Armenia at some point. Let's talk about the West. And you mentioned Biden's recognition of Armenian genocide. He spoke the word. Is that important in the great scheme of things? Is this, and I understand, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm asking an ethnic Armenian that, but is it helping more than it's sort of like giving people false hope? The kind of false hope that Armenians were laboring under, and when the West's assistance did not really materialize when the war happened. If I were Armenian, honestly, I would be very disappointed. I'm trying to understand, are you disappointed as an Armenian American? Are people in general disappointed by the West's incapability, seemingly, to step in and do something for 44 days? It was not a blitzkrieg by any means.
Well, I'm not disappointed, but I'm surprised. I'm surprised in terms of the benign neglect, the deafening silence, even beyond the rhetoric. Having said that, the real decisive elements of this war was not the West or its failure to react, but it was the unprecedented direct Turkish military support. And secondly, more importantly, the serious mistake by Armenia of underestimating Azerbaijan, insultingly, underestimating their capability, capacity, and will to fight. Having said that, I think most people in Armenia never expected Russia to intervene on behalf of Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia has long clarified any security obligation is limited to the Republic of Armenia proper. At the same time, what we forget is militarily, this was a war largely between Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, and the standing army of Nagorno-Karabakh. This was not an interstate war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is lost in the analysis. And I think it's very important that Pashinyan, in one area, is not being criticized for what he didn't do. In other words, Armenia was never fully engaged in this war, and Pashinyan could be criticized for not fully engaging in terms of the Armenian Air Force, etc. Now, it was a different calculation, but at the same time, this was very much an opening for Russia. And militarily, Russia and only Russia was in a position to act. However, the interesting thing was not the West. The more interesting thing was Azerbaijan's bold, successful defiance of Russia, not stopping the war sooner, not going to Moscow to agree to a ceasefire when Moscow demanded or expected it. The Azerbaijani side called the bluff of the Kremlin and openly defied Moscow and still does. And I think that's the real interesting part. Having said that, the Europeans and the Americans are re-engaging. The Americans now, with the recent visit of the State Department official, Phil Rieker, in the region, brokering the prisoner return, and Biden's engagement or attempt to come up with a new strategy to make the Americans relevant in the region, with the European Union's involvement. Now, the reason I stress this is I see Russia uncharacteristically wanting the West to engage, to bring in the US to legitimize Russia's unilateral deployment of peacekeepers. It's the opposite of Crimea. The Americans will actually accept Russia's diplomatic initiative and lead on the ground. The Europeans will be welcomed by Moscow for post-war stability to pay the price, to pay the financing costs, which Moscow doesn't want to continue absorbing. And in terms of post-war stability, all trade and transport is also at the Russian initiative. This is why the two losers here, the first is Georgia, which is further isolated in this Russian vision of post-war stability. The second loser is Turkey, who was much more invested in the war, but was disappointed in its diminished role in the post-war reality. Russia came in at the last minute, and Turkey was sidelined.
Richard, I feel like we've only started talking, but I kept you on the air for 1 hour and 18 minutes, and I appreciate your time. Let me ask you one final question and exact a promise that we will see you soon after the elections in Armenia, and we will talk about what actually will have transpired by then. Let me ask you this. You're uniquely positioned, as I said, because you've lived in the United States. If I'm not mistaken, you were born in the United States. You're part of what we call the Armenian diaspora. What is the diaspora? Is it a monolithic, let's say, group of people who think one way and there is homogeneity in terms of the future of Armenia you all want to see? Does it clash with the views of people from the region or maybe a diaspora of Armenians in Russia? I mean, do you all Armenians inside and outside the country see the future direction with the same set of eyes, or is there a lot of a difference? And what role does diaspora play in all this? I mean, I heard the expression that diasporas are often more intransigent than the populations in the regions themselves. And I may be one of the example of that. During the war, I became pretty, my views have changed and my normal MO has changed. And my outspokenness, if that's the word, has changed. What is the role of diaspora? Is it a constructive role? Is there a convergence of views on the future of the region?
Very good question. One observation. And again, having grown up, having been in the Armenian diaspora, but I would say no longer because I'm now local. One observation is, in the words of my friend and colleague, Alexander Iskandarian, who's a Russian speaker political scientist here in Armenia, he always explains there's no such thing as one diaspora. It's like an onion. You can peel off the levels from France to Argentina to Russia, where there's unique characteristics. One example is the Armenians in Russia are the financial powers in Armenia. They account for 90% of remittances to Armenia, and it's the destination for migrant labor. Whereas the Armenians in America, Canada, in the West are the political advocacy powers in terms of political lobbying. What's interesting is one positive development for the diaspora, the defining issue, the only defining issue for many decades was the Armenian genocide and Turkey. That's changed. And even now, democracy, economic development, human rights in Armenia is much more important than it once was. And that's a positive trend. But there's a general failure to communicate on both sides. The Armenian government doesn't understand the diaspora. The diaspora is actually distant and remote from Armenia. For example, my grandfather's from Turkey, survived the genocide, went to the United States. I don't have any relatives here. For 7 decades, this was the Soviet Union. It was closed to us. And even the language we speak is slightly different. The food is different. There's going to be a natural divide. But over time, this positive trend of investing more in development, democracy, rather than just genocide recognition, will actually bring us to a level of maturity and graduating to harness that synergy. And it is in some ways empowering, but it also requires an Armenian government that's more democratic and more receptive to this.
Richard, thank you very much. Let's put a comma here, and with our hopes to talk to you sometime soon. We will wish you a good night. It's late in Yerevan, and enjoy the football game.
Well, thank you. I also look forward to a post-election assessment.
We'll definitely love to have you for that. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Richard Giragosian joining us from Yerevan, the Armenian capital, with the pre-election analysis. And as you can see, and as our guest has conceded, Azerbaijan and the war with Azerbaijan and the current situation between the two countries and the future relations with Azerbaijan are a prominent factor in the Armenian elections. We do hope to see our guest today, a couple of weeks from now, as we had said, to discuss what will have happened at the polls in Armenia. We do hope that the elections in that country are free and fair, and as our guest said, the indications are that they will be free and fair. I believe that would be a good example for the region. We'll be watching, and I hope you will be watching with us. I understand that, again, let me apologize, today's language for the conversation was English. It's not optimal. We understand that it's not as accessible to many in the region, but there is no other language in which our guest and I could understand each other. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the football game as well. I'll be watching. You will be watching. We understand that we have a slight competition these days in terms of, the European Football Championship. We appreciate your time. We appreciate the portion of the evening you have spent with us. I saw your questions. I appreciate your interest. And let's talk sometime in the future. We will see you on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Depending on the game schedule. We'll have to play around that, unfortunately. And have a good night. Thank you from Washington. Bye-bye.